welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here, and we're so happy that you could be with us tonight for an evening with Amaryllis Fox. I have a feeling some of you have probably read a few things about Ms. Fox, but I'm going to give you a little background anyway, because it's so very interesting. Amaryllis Fox was in her last year as an undergraduate at Oxford studying theology and international law when her writing mentor, Daniel Pearl, was captured and beheaded. She was galvanized by this brutality, and she applied to the master's program in conflict and terrorism at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And there she created an algorithm that predicted the likelihood of a terrorist cell arising in any village around the world. At 21, she was recruited by the CIA. Now, her years in the agency are the basis for her riveting memoir, Life Undercover, which I'm sure I see a lot of copies, and I know people are going to want you to sign those later. And that's what she's going to discuss tonight. So I'll move on to following her CIA career in the field. Fox has covered current events and offered analysis for CNN, National Geographic, Al Jazeera, the BBC, and other global news outlets. She speaks at events in universities around the world on the topic of peacemaking. She is the co-host of History Channel's series American Ripper and lives in Los Angeles, California with her husband and daughter. She tonight will be interviewed by Kaj Larson. Larson is an Emmy-nominated producer and correspondent. He is currently the creator and executive producer of the Netflix original series, The Business of Drugs. Prior to Netflix, Larson was a correspondent for the Emmy Award-winning show Vice on HBO. He was a correspondent at CNN as a member of its Special Investigations and Documentary Unit, and a journalist for the Vanguard Unit at Current TV. He was the first journalist to be waterboarded on national television, the only journalist embedded in the fight against Boko Haram, and the first Western video journalist in Mogadishu in more than a decade. Prior to his work in television, Larson spent 5 years on active duty, serving as a U.S. Navy SEAL. We've got a powerhouse up here tonight. These two people are so amazing. And finally, as a lieutenant, not finally, he led a team of special warfare personnel in covert operations overseas, deploying as a detachment commander in support of the global war on terrorism. Please join me in welcoming Amaryllis and Kaj to the stage. Thank you. Kaj is going to be asking the questions, but at the end there'll be time for just a few audience questions, probably fewer than you would like, but we'll be taking them from this microphone here. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome to this format. I'm not sure why we chose this particular institution for this talk, but been told to me by friends in the intelligence community that espionage is the second oldest profession in the world, but not nearly as well respected as the first. And perhaps that is because in some ways it's more palatable to sell your body than it is to sell your soul. And throughout the course of your book, you talk about how wrenching the work was on your soul and on your person. But I'm curious, in the beginning, early Amaryllis, what was it in your soul that compelled you and drove you towards the intelligence community?
Well, I will answer that, but I think when you were talking, it really struck me that at its very best, in my experiences, human intelligence sometimes gives people in their darkest moments, and I'm talking about potential sources, really the ability to save their soul. You know, in many cases, people are in a place where they don't even see in themselves the potential to make this leap from a destructive, violent spasm that they're in the midst of, to leaving a legacy of courage and of life-saving. And when somebody can see that glimmer in them and cultivate it, some of the very best sources who have done the most on behalf of humanity, and have been able to salvage their soul in that way, have come from that process. So one of the things that I think is a challenge around this work is that the Hollywood and the TV, images that we see are so different from the reality of the work. And so when it comes to whether or not it's respected and whether or not we think of it as selling your soul or in fact giving people the opportunity to save it, a lot of that comes down to what's out there, and one of the things that I hope that these stories can do is to share those moments where really at its best it can be quite a soulful experience. But to your question about childhood, I grew up moving every year, mainly within Africa, Asia, and I felt very heavily the challenges and threats and suffering that I saw around me as a little kid, and the fact that we could leave, and many of the people who I was surrounded by couldn't. The kids that, I would drop a soccer ball in a field each time. My birthday's in September, and, moving every year, you're surrounded by a bunch of new kids for your birthday, don't know anyone, and you learn pretty quickly that a soccer ball is a pretty international offering of friendship. And to then at the end of each of those years leave and know that others don't have that opportunity, began to weigh quite heavily on me. And then between my high school and university, I took some time off and went as an aspiring baby journalist to the Thai-Burmese border, and was working to tell the stories of refugees living in the camps there. And while I was there, found a kind of home in a group of Burmese dissidents who had fled across the border and were producing a democracy newspaper on mimeograph machines in the jungle, and sending it back across the border into Burma. And at the time, Burma was as close to North Korea today as any other regime out there. And they were planning an uprising of the students, a democracy protest against the military government that was going to take place on 9/9/99, a kind of echo of 8/8/88. And they wanted to be sure that if those students were gunned down in the way that they had been in 1988, that there was some journalist there to document it. And in the kind of teenage sense of immortality that we all have when we're young, I said, yeah, of course I'll go, irrationally, without a visa and without any ability to go there, and ultimately was able to. I mean, called a friend who was working at an investment bank so he could get a business visa. We pretended to be on our honeymoon, went in, with satchels to hide our film in, and Bic pens we could wrap the film around in order to get it out. And we ended up interviewing Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, while she was still under house arrest. And I think that was a really crystallizing moment for me, where I had felt very heavily the weight of what these military regimes can do to people who can't escape them. And then in that moment, sitting with Aung San Suu Kyi, who is this one tiny, physically petite, fragile woman, whose words were so dangerous to this military regime that they would arrest you just for speaking with her. And when we walked out of the building, we did in fact get arrested and detained, managed to get the film out. That film was put back together at the BBC Bureau in Bangkok and broadcast on shortwave back into Burma. And it was electrifying for me. I mean, that was really the first time in my life that I understood the power of truth-telling, and how far adversaries, military regimes, authoritarian regimes will go to shut that down. And I think it became a kind of natural path.
Certainly, I mean, what's so amazing about that anecdote when you tell it in the book, and like, yes, it's perfect foreshadowing in a way for the life that you were to lead. You're using dead drops, you're caching documents, you're operating with a cover story, right? And you're doing this as a journalist, and in its highest form, intelligence gathering and journalism, the Venn diagram should intersect. They should converge, right? Because you're seeking the truth. But it's so amazing that you did all of this at an early age, and then you continued to do it, just, financed by the U.S. government ultimately.
Well, I mean, I didn't think that would be a path. I actually was first approached by intelligence at Oxford as an undergrad, and they were British. And at that stage, I said, daylight is the best disinfectant. Thanks for the pint. Walked out of the pub, the Fuggle and Firkin in Central Oxford. And it really, at that stage, continuing a path towards journalism and towards work in the NGO community was really the path that I had chosen. It wasn't until 9/11, which was right before my last year, and the subsequent death of Danny Pearl, who was such a hero of mine for his tolerant, pluralistic writing, that the need to understand this new type of conflict and this new type of adversary in order to not be afraid of it really came to the forefront for me, and I began to focus on understanding and predicting these acts.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because I've just been telling all our friends that you like whiskey and not gin, that like the gin martini just didn't do it for you. So you ended up in the American Intelligence Services. But so 9/11 catalyzes you, and then you start working on this algorithm, and you're working on this in graduate school, effectively. And can you elucidate that for the audience a little bit?
Sure.
Because this is actually how we
first met.
know each other. Right?
Yeah.
And part of the reason that I'm here today is not just because Amaryllis is my friend and my colleague, because there's a really interesting convergence between the intelligence community and the operational community. And unbeknownst to us, we met a decade later in the civilian world, and we were both doing journalism and media. But unbeknownst to us, we had actually collaborated on a project from a distance remotely before, which was an extension of her work at Georgetown. Yeah.
Yeah, so my dad, when I was a little kid, had always taught me that when something is scary as a child, that the way to get over that is to understand it. And the first time that happened was this vampire bat that my brother had and would torment me with. It was a toy, but when you squeezed it, it had this plastic proboscis that would go up to your arm, and it looked like it was sucking blood. And I started to have nightmares about it when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I would wake my parents up because I was afraid of it. And probably because he finally wanted to get some sleep, my dad one night just turned the light on, and he laid the bat out on a towel on the floor, and he opened it up, cut open its stomach, opened it up, and it had all of these little plastic workings, and you could see the gears, you could see the little bladder that when you pressed its stomach, it made the proboscis spin red. And I was never afraid of it anymore, because I understood the inner workings that made it look scary. And that kind of frivolous example was actually really helpful to me a few years later when I was in 3rd grade. One of my dear friends and her entire family were on the flight that went down over Lockerbie, Scotland. And it was the first time that I'd known someone who died. And my dad, again, at that point said, you need to understand the forces that took her, or you'll be afraid of them forever. And he introduced me to the newspaper, and that was world-changing for me. And so when 9/11 happened and all of that trauma was renewed, I went back to that same advice. You have to understand the things that scare you. And so I began looking at historical data to see whether there were correlations that might be unexpected but could help to predict and prevent these terror groups from from making safe haven in places around the world. And it turns out there are, things like the percentage beneath livable wage that a border guard gets paid, and therefore the potential for graft, or the ratio of hookah bars to madrasas and the rate of change of that ratio in terms of the instability that modernization can bring to some of these places. And there were a number of them, and it turns out that when you look at the data, you can weigh each of them differently, 0 to 1, and put all of those weighted inputs together in an algorithm that will tell you the relative risk of all of the regions that you're putting in, so that you know where to look and why. And this was a graduate school project. It was still very, very clumsy, but it allowed me to begin to get my arms around the human experiences and the causes for these completely abhorrent acts that seem inexplicable. And that was what I was working on at the School of Foreign Service when the CIA officer in residence asked me about it. And he was incredibly humble and curious in our conversation. Humble about the recognition that there were things in the world that neither of us understood, and curious about what they were and how to learn more about them. And he asked me if I thought I got all the inputs. And I remember saying to him, I think I got most of the inputs I can get at the Georgetown University Library and on the internet and microfiche,
right.
to date myself.
Yeah. AOL dial-up at the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A triangle and the key.
Yeah.
And I said to him, what I really think is more useful than that is being able to actually sit down across from somebody who's about to commit one of these horrendous crimes and to understand from them, eye to eye, why it is that they're going to do that. That's what I'm interested in knowing. And he said, so are we. And that was the first time that intelligence work seemed like something of worth and value to me.
And then you continued to work at that as you finished out your time at Georgetown, right? So
That's
you're
right.
you're moonlighting for the agency effectively while running, being a full-time graduate student, which is a preview of your life to come.
Yeah. There were a lot of early mornings and late nights spanning Keybridge in those days. But they were worlds that informed one another hugely. I remember the kind of agency house style for the SEEB and the PRB seeping into my academic writing style, bullet points, and you certainly develop an ability to be succinct and to put actionable information at the top. And so I think that in some ways it was helpful. It also allowed me time in the analysis world to understand how all of the pieces from the field fit together.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that was early days in the global war on terror, and one of the things that the algorithm did was help predict conflict. And then those predictions sometimes resulted in real-world actions, so you had people like me and my platoons going downrange in these low-intensity conflicts.
Yeah, talk about that, the downrange repercussions of that algorithm.
Right, and so, what happens starts in the academic halls of Georgetown and is so fascinating, has real-world consequences, and Amaryllis and I discovered this later on when we first met each other, and like any two people that come from a profession that's layered in secrecy and where there's lots of stuff where you don't know what you can talk about and what you can reveal and stuff, when we first got to know each other, there was a lot of sort of dancing around the gorilla, right? The Marines have this crude saying, we had to get the butt sniffing out of the way, right? Two dogs figuring each other out. And we quickly learned that we both had this relationship to a low intensity conflict that was in southern Thailand, which was actually my first deployment, where we were hunting a separatist group on the southern Thai border, the Thai-Malaysian border, with the Thai Special Forces. That was my first operational deployment. It turns out that Amaryllis was back at agency headquarters helping organize that operation. So a distant person that I didn't know, as I was the kinetic downrange implementation of the algorithm. It definitely made us feel like we had kind of walked in the mud together.
Walked in the mud together.
Yeah.
Those southernmost provinces are the only majority Muslim areas in Thailand, and have had on and off again a movement that sometimes aims for independence, sometimes aims for secession to Malaysia. But it's actually one of my favorite conflict resolution stories. That particular one wound up in large part because the Thai government, in deciding whether or not to go fully kinetic, did something very different. They had every school child in Thailand make a peace crane and write a message on it. And they took those and they filled a military transport aircraft with them and opened the back and released all of those cranes there, and demonstrated to the people of these southernmost provinces that they were loved and valued as Thai citizens. And, of course, it isn't perfect kumbaya that comes out of that, but I've talked to many people in that area that said that that was a gesture of respect and inclusion that really made a big difference in bringing an end to that particular spasm there.
Yeah, and also one of these amazing thousands of anecdotes that didn't quite make it
Yeah,
in the
that's
book,
right
but is really relevant to how you developed throughout the course of the job. I think it's also it has really important explanatory power of this undertold story of the relationship between intelligence and operations. People don't realize, or it's an undertold story, that the bin Laden raid was a product of many years of this kind of collaboration and cooperation between the agency and the operational SEAL teams specifically, right? You asked the question when it came down to that fateful moment, why did President Obama choose to go with naval special warfare, the SEAL community, as opposed to Delta Force? And it was the product of this long working relationship that had developed in places like southern Thailand and then all the way through Iraq and Afghanistan that ultimately led to that mission, which is obviously very high profile.
It is really a brother and sisterhood, and one of the interesting things about the Hollywood portrayals of human intelligence is that oftentimes I feel as though they're actually representing more of the paramilitary side of that partnership rather than the long, slow work of cultivating the sources and the information that informs it, in part because it doesn't look quite so kinetic on screen. But I think that it's really important to remember that, the real core of human intelligence actually is that relationship building that can lead to making sure that the targets are the correct ones or the acts of war are predicted and prevented.
Yeah, I'd love to explore that a little, and we've talked about it for years and years, but one of my favorite parts of reading the book, as non-objective as I am, because I know many of the characters involved, including your ex-husband, Dean, who is Zoe's dad. And how many people have read the book out of curiosity? Just
I think
or
it only just
excerpts?
came out, so
Yeah.
don't feel pressure.
You guys, nobody did their homework in this room? Okay.
That's all right. It makes our story
Good.
less boring
Yeah,
if they
exactly.
haven't already read them.
It's all for the first time, yeah. Okay, so one thing you should know about Amaryllis' trajectory and path is that she met her ex-husband at the agency, fellow case officer, actually at the farm, which is the training pipeline for the agency, and they had a child overseas, and he went to work in a more paramilitary component aspect of the CIA at some point. And one of the things that I find so amazing about the book, as you weave the personal and professional together, is that you had this beautiful relationship with Dean, but there was this schism in it. And in some ways, it represents the schism that was happening within the agency, right? And there's this sort of philosophical debate that was happening in the agency. Are we an intelligence gathering operation, or are we a kinetic operation,
Yeah.
right? And you were very firmly in the intelligence gathering component, the human component, and Dean was very firmly in the kinetic world. And so I'm curious if you could talk about how that was true professionally, and then also how that was true writ large in terms of what it represented at the agency.
Yeah, I think this for me was such a lesson in all of us believing in the things that we have experienced working, and so much of our disagreement, I think, personally, politically in our country and overseas, comes down to my experiences are different from yours, and therefore what I have seen work and not work is different, and we can, go to loggerheads on it because the truth that you've experienced feels like the only truth often. And when I was coming up, there was the surge, and the surge at the time, this was, intelligence officers who were pulled out of a kind of more traditional pipeline in order to go and augment in a paramilitary capacity. And for everyone, including Dean, who went that path, the experience of this conflict, the experience of preventing attacks, was very kinetic. It was convoys and clearing compounds and the kind of night work that we tend to associate with combat theaters. And for more traditional human collectors, you're working outside of combat theaters, often to inform what's happening inside of them, but in very traditional environments where you're doing the kind of longer, slower, more soulful work of cultivating relationships with people who have a unique position or a unique capability to provide insights, not just into what's happening, but into what is going to happen. And I think that is one of the things that makes human intelligence so critical to our national security, because, sometimes I think there can be a tendency to feel that technology is so advanced these days that, why even risk humans? Why not just use technical approaches and have a sense of what's going on that way? And I always compare it to, everyone has the friends that they follow on Instagram or Facebook, and then the friends that they actually see once a week, for a drink after work or whatever it is. And the friends that you follow on Instagram and Facebook, the headlines of their life, right? You would know if they'd had a baby, you would know if they'd gotten married. If their name comes up when you're talking with somebody, you can say, oh yeah, they're expecting a baby coming up here. But what you don't know is how they're feeling about their marriage, what's going to happen next in it, whether they're considering leaving their job. You only kind of know the actual facts rather than being able to understand this person, their struggles, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, enough to be able to predict what's going to happen next. Whereas the person that you're meeting and seeing on a regular basis, you have that insight into them, and therefore you can make much better predictions about what's going to happen next rather than just reporting what's going on right now. And I think that really is in many ways the distinction between human intelligence gathering and signals intelligence gathering. And it's absolutely crucial because we really can't understand what is going to stop these heinous acts of violence and acts of war if we don't understand who the people are who are committing them and what the motivations are that are driving that. And so for me, the human world has always been one of the kind of treasures of national security, because I think when any president looks at the assortment of options in front of him or her, there are a range of military options, of course diplomatic options, but the human intelligence option is very unique in that it represents the ability to actually build a back channel to communicate and even at times collaborate to bring an end to war. And that's something that I think will continue to be critical to our national security, however advanced our technology gets.
Yeah, and one of the things that's so fascinating is you were operating during the peak of your operational career and in the middle of these two global war on terrorism, these counterterrorism-centric wars, but you were primarily tasked with counterproliferation. So you're working on these big geostrategic issues. So I'm curious now, like when you reflect both at that moment and then fast forward to today in real time, there's some Venn diagram intersection of those two, but what is the vampire bat of today? Like what scares you and what do we need to take apart and understand?
Funnily enough, I think there are a range of very serious threats that exist and remain to U.S. national security from outside of our borders, right? There are the rogue states, there are our geopolitical adversaries, there are the terror groups. the terror groups in particular have splintered and become a lot harder to combat. But we have one of the best, if not the best, military and intelligence infrastructure in the world to predict, prevent, respond to those attacks. The vampire bat that keeps me up at the moment is the threat that the fractures we ourselves are creating internally inside of our house have the potential to create for our national security. You know, every school kid learns that Lincoln said a house divided cannot stand, right? And our adversaries learned it too. And I think when they rightly figured out that they had been outgunned and outspent on the battlefield and couldn't possibly win in a traditional sense, it is not surprising that we have seen many of them, not just Russia, many of them, both states and non-state actors, move in different ways to fuel both sides of wedge issues in this country. And it is astonishing to me how we play right into their hands, how when I turn on the news, I see people retreat to their respective corners and kind of indulge in this dopamine hit of surrounding themselves by people that agree with them and lobbing grenades at the other side without realizing that there's a reason our adversaries aren't funding just one or the other. They're funding the extremes of every single issue. And it's because none of those issues in and of themselves have the power to bring us down. It's the division between them that really has that power to fracture our house from the inside. And that is something that our military and intelligence infrastructure can't save us from. You know, that's something that is on each and every one of us. And I really do believe that finding common ground with one another right now is the greatest act of patriotism any of us can engage in, because there is no military might that can save us from tearing ourselves apart from the inside.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you know this, but inadvertently, I think you saved my life one time when I was in northern Nigeria, and I was meeting with the leaders of Boko Haram, and they had kidnapped these 300 schoolgirls from a town called Chibok. And I was meeting with some of these guys who were holding these women in the Sambisa forest, and the knuckle-dragging, Paleolithic seal frogman part of me wanted to reach across the table and rip their throats out and find out where these girls were. And I imagine you tell that very fascinating anecdote from Pakistan when you were working on the AQ Khan network. The same thing. Here you are sitting with people who are actually considering deploying a weapon, right, in a major urban city in Karachi, right? How do you think about those moments? I myself had to repeat your mantra of listen to your enemies and understand where you're coming from. How do you think about those moments, and then how do we translate those into our current civil discourse? Doesn't sound like the right term, uncivil discourse that you're referring to.
Not to mention my dad again, I love you, Dad. I've brought him up a lot, but I do have this very strong memory of being a kid at the dinner table, and I was sitting at one end and my brother was sitting at the other, and we had been squabbling over something, and my dad, who used to be a professor and has a great way of explaining things, picked something up, and I couldn't really tell what it was at the beginning, and he held it up and asked me what shape it was, and I said it was a triangle. You know, I was old enough to know my shapes, and it was very clearly a triangle. He asked my brother, who was sitting at the other side of the table, what shape it was, and he said it was a square. And my dad opened his hand, and it was one of my little sister's building blocks, and it was in the shape of a pyramid. And I had been able to see the triangular side, my brother had been able to see the square side. And my dad said, you two started this conversation knowing that the other person was an intelligent, trustworthy person. But you could have gone all night saying, no, it's a triangle, no, it's a square. And you were both so sure of what you saw that slowly you would have begun to believe that the other person was either very stupid and ill-informed and didn't know their shapes, or malicious and lying, because there's no other explanation, because you're so sure of what you saw, unless you have the discipline to always search for the higher dimension, for the pyramid, right? What is the model that would allow the truth that you are so confident in to still be true, while also allowing somebody else's experiences to be equally true. And so searching for the pyramid in situations became a shorthand in my family and eventually in my work and in my life for trying to understand a more three-dimensional model of the world and of experiences. And it's really helped me to be able to climb into other perspectives. And that is crucial in finding some sliver of commonality that you can then begin to build a dialogue on. One of the things that I think we often fall prey to is the inertia in a conversation where when you begin to disagree, you know, whether it's because of pride or ego or tunnel vision, you just dig your heels in deeper and deeper and nobody changes the subject and the knot you're pulling together is tightening and tightening and you're not getting anywhere. And one of the things to do in that moment I have found, whether it's dealing with adversaries who want to kill you or dealing with, you know, that uncle at the Thanksgiving table who has very different opinion about politics than you do, is to pause for a minute and take that hat off. We all wear many hats in life, and to search around for another one that that person shares. And it seems so simple, but in those moments, if we set something aside for a minute and can connect as fellow parents who are both going through a particular struggle on behalf of our children, or in this country, you know, connect on some other aspect of American life that we love, whether that's a pop culture moment or it's, you know, love for our national parks, whatever the thing is that you know you share. It doesn't make this area of legitimate disagreement go away, but I have found time and again that it loosens that knot. And when you return to it, you have shared some kind of mutual respect. To the point where you can be a little bit more curious about one another's points of view and sometimes make a little bit more progress. The other thing that I think is that we should be more alert to is the role of language and linguistic tags. Because, you know, one of the examples that I often give of the fact that we're often saying the same thing, but we think we're disagreeing because we're calling it two different things. You know, I studied theology at university. I thought I might join the clergy at some point. Still don't totally count it out. And I'm always curious as I travel around the world about all of the different faith traditions and philosophies that are out there. And here domestically, even within the United States, I often will talk to folks who have very, very traditional sort of faith journeys, and they'll talk about the power of prayer. And then out in my kind of California group of friends, there's this more like, people will talk about the power to manifest things, right? Like, I manifested this boyfriend, I manifested this job. And when you talk to both of those groups of people, I'll ask them, like, that's interesting, tell me about that. And they both say basically the exact same thing, which is, I know it seems weird, but time and again, I've had this experience where if I get really quiet and I feel grateful for what I have, and then I kind of put a need out into the universe, that need gets met. And I know it sounds crazy, Amaryllis, but I've experienced it and it's wild, you know? And that's one of the most profound human mysteries that any of us can go through. And such a potential area to connect with somebody, regardless of what else you believe in the world. But because one group calls it the power of prayer and thinks that the manifesting people are kind of like liberal, hippie, like evildoers, and the manifesting people often think the power of prayer people are more, you know, traditional, conservative, closed-minded. These two communities miss the opportunity to connect on something extraordinary that would allow them to come back to areas of something as mundane as politics with a little bit more respect for one another's soul and one another's experience being human. So I think we need to be alert to these instances where language divides us when we're actually describing the exact same thing.
Yeah, and I think the common ground lesson is very well spoken, right? And at some very high 50,000 foot level, if you can talk to someone from an AQ Khan network in Pakistan, and I can talk to someone in northern Nigeria from Boko Haram, like, we should be able to talk, you know, a Californian to someone from St. Louis,
Yeah,
right? Like there should
maybe
be
we can talk to our
theoretically
neighbors,
more
right?
common ground there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of what you were saying reminds me of, I think this was not meant as a pejorative, it was actually meant as a compliment, but there's a New York Times article about the book out that's wonderful that says you're kind of almost have this Marianne Williamson
I
affect
loved
about
her.
right.
I think she's great.
And I think in that same article it says that that the book is sort of like John Le Carre meets Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
I think is right, which sounds like a way of selling a series in
screenplay,
Hollywood.
I feel
Yeah,
like that's
right.
a very Hollywood pitch.
But one of the things that I love about the book so much that I haven't really heard you talk about is it is as much literature as it is memoir. The writing is gorgeous. It's beautiful. It really exposes your true soul. So I'm just curious, who were your literary influences when you were writing?
Well, on the intelligence side, I think that Graham Greene is an incredibly talented writer in his ability to tell these very human stories and paint these multiple shades of gray, because nothing is black and white on the ground out there. I'm sure you have the same experience where it's always the folks who have not actually served in any of these places that have very clear lines and views around who's responsible for what. It gets a lot murkier when you're out there, and I think that Graham Greene does a beautiful job of painting the humanity of the intelligence world, of conflict. And on the film side, I think that Stephen Gagin does an amazing job. Syriana, I thought, was a fantastic portrayal of those same things. And from a memoir perspective, I think there are so many wonderful ones out there. The vulnerability and rawness of some of these books that have been, commercially very successful. You see Wild and The Glass Castle and Andy Eat, Pray, Love. These are stories that may feel really accessible, but that's the beauty in them, and it was very important to me that this story feel completely relatable, because even though it's set in maybe a different context from many people's experience, the personal questions are the same ones that we all face, right? Every parent struggles with this question of, is my job to be at home reading Goodnight Moon to my little one every night, or is my job to be out making the world that little one is going to inherit a better and safer place? And how do I straddle that and manage those two things? Every person who's been in a relationship, I think, knows the idea of saying one thing when there's another subtext that both parties know underneath it, right? And maybe that is not always because of operational considerations, but it has the same impact on the relationship, regardless really of the cause, where communication becomes multi-layered and not as open, shall we say, as it could be. And I think so many people have those experiences that it's important to remember that, the intelligence officers and, by the way, their adversaries that we see on the Hollywood screen, who are kind of these one-dimensional, all good or all evil, but also all day, every day focused on their battle, are not the reality. The reality is that, our heroes and our villains are actually beautiful, banal, everyday human beings. And even though they have moments of great drama and great conflict, they also get frustrated by traffic and have challenging relationships and love their kids and worry about a high temperature in the middle of the night and all of those things. And so this book, though it has the operational through line that were kind of the interactions that knocked a lot of these lessons into me, the personal story really is the core of the book, and I think it's hard enough to know who you are in your 20s in any event. And so to come of age in an environment where necessarily there are some deceptions and security measures makes that all the harder. But I think it's actually a story that's familiar to everyone, this notion of, who am I? Which version of myself is true?
Yeah. I want to come back to the little one, but I want to stoke a debate that you and I have had many times is, before my first deployment in the SEAL teams, they made us read and then sent us to a lecture. They brought in a guy named Colonel John Grossman, who wrote a book called On Killing. And one of the stipulations that he gives, that he acknowledges in his book and in his talks when he engages with young men and women, no women in the SEAL teams, but when he talks to young men from the special operations community, is that part of the process of killing involves dehumanizing your enemy, right? So I'm curious how you personally have reconciled this idea that you have to humanize your enemies with the fact that we also kill our enemies, and how that sat with you, and what understanding you've come to.
I mean, that is absolutely true. The dehumanizing happens right from the get-go in war fighting, right? Necessarily for psychological reasons. And we see it with, I remember folks using terms like half-souls, right? And sending around compiled videos of airstrikes set to rock the Casbah and all of the things that happen as psychological armor to distance yourself a little bit from the feeling that you're killing another human being, and that that human being, might also be a person of worth or a child of God.
It's certainly easier to kill a half soul than a soul.
And I think that as much as that might make the job easier, I don't think making the job easier is what we want to be doing. And this is something that comes up when people ask me whether their little girls, whether I would want their daughters to join the intelligence community or the military community. And what I always say to that is that I think the people who are least likely to find personal happiness in this work are actually the ones that we need the most badly doing it. The people who will really struggle with the moral complexity, who really feel the weight of that responsibility and the loneliness of that this work often comes with, are actually those we need most. Because, if you're getting into it because you dig the power trip or you aren't concerned about the half souls, that it's not going to turn out in a productive way, shall we say, right? Because we know from years and years of trying that you can't prevent violence through violence alone. You create
As Stan
more
McChrystal
Hydra's
said, we
heads.
can't shoot our way out of this problem.
100%.
Right?
We know that we risk, with every strike, creating more adversaries than we destroy. The Hydra's heads multiply. It has to be a multi-pronged approach, right? And
so you're saying you want, in a theoretical world, you want trigger pullers, loosely defined, who are the most reticent to engage?
I mean, the most cognizant of the reality of what they're doing, right? I think it's very important for, certainly there are times where incredibly difficult choices need to be made, but they need to be made with a full awareness of the human cost on all sides. And often there's a civilian component to that, and these are decisions that have long-term ramifications. And I think one of the huge challenges that humankind has always faced, and certainly we face in a democracy with a short election cycle, is this tension between short and long-term thinking. And often there is a way to shoot yourself out of a short-term threat. But what any student of even recent history, let alone all of history, realizes very quickly is that shooting your way out of a short-term threat very reliably ends up producing a long-term threat, because the adversary goes away, they're shamed, they're humiliated, they're full of vengeance and grief, and they lick their wounds and find a way to come back and get their comeuppance. And that has been the cycle that we have seen over and over and over again. And the ability to cut through that circle is one that I think human intelligence really plays a role in. But beyond that, each and every one of us plays a role in our portrayals, our ability to reach out while traveling. I mean, I think each of us is basically an American diplomat every time we go overseas. And even in the most raw war zones, I'm sure you've had the same experience. The love for Americans, not always the American government policies, but the love for Americans and American culture and American music and American city on the hill is so alive. And I feel it every time I'm in these environments. And those are the connections that I think have to continue to be cultivated. And the danger of allowing ourselves to feel more comfortable about war by dehumanizing the enemy is that we cut ourselves off from the ability to cultivate those relationships that could actually bring an end to that war rather than just kicking the can down the road.
Fair, fair. Let's switch topics and talk about one of my favorite human beings in the world, who is Zoe, your daughter. And it's probably not fun for you to be a doting mother, but I can be a doting crazy uncle about her. She's really an extraordinary old soul. She really is. Like, you look at her, you talk to her, she is wise. She has the wisdom of multiple generations. And she was really seminal in this inflection point in your life of deciding to leave the clandestine services. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You know, I think kids see the truth in a way that we've probably all experienced, right? I mean, they just clock you right off the bat, and they know everything the moment they look you in the eye. I'm a dorky physics book reader, like the kind of physics books that are not college level, that you just buy at Barnes and Noble, read, feel like you understand, and then can't explain to an 11-year-old. And every time I try to explain one to Zoe, she'll look at me and she's like, "You've got to go back and read that again. You don't understand it." They clock you. And so from the moment that I had Zoe, she would connect with me, even as a baby, only when I was in my authentic self. When I would lose sight of all of the overthinking and analysis and watching this and tracking that, and laugh. I describe a scene in the book where we're sitting by a koi pond, and I'm watching the koi, and I kind of just out loud to her, to no one, say, "We must look really funny to that fish, huh?" The fisheye view of things. And I just laugh at the thought of what this fish thinks looking up at us. And Zoe locks eyes with me and just beams. And it was the first time that I'd really seen her light up and seen her smile as a baby. And she became for me a little bit of a kind of Yoda figure, where she would respond and connect most strongly when I was most authentically and vulnerably myself. And oftentimes in I think operational environments, but even when you walk into a party and you don't know anyone here at home, right? In the most personal, mundane environments, when you feel nervous, there's a tendency to lock your armor down, right? To look cooler or more powerful or braver than you are. And even though that is our base instinct, the counterintuitive truth of the matter is that often shedding that armor and being vulnerable and allowing your humanity to show and to connect with other people's humanity oftentimes is more powerful than the armor itself. And I think it was Zoe who really began to lead me to that understanding. She made me better at my job. She also, I think, awoke in me the realization that these same tools that the human intelligence world uses to create relationships and dialogue between adversaries could be used outside of the world of geopolitics in our own communities. And that ultimately was the moment that I left and felt that I had given this form of service all that I was meant to, and then took these same tools and began to experiment with applying them in other parts of our community. So I started with prisoners who were preparing to make amends to the survivors of their crimes. And then gang members who, as you know, my work there with dropping gang affiliations and integrating with one another in small business opportunities in order to move past those gang affiliations. And then overseas, back in northern Iraq, in the IDP and refugee camps there, where you have Sunni and Shia young people who have both lost family members to one another's parents. Who have this opportunity at 18, 19, 20 years old in the same camps to choose a pathway, right? Whether they're going to continue to be the next link in the chain of their parents' war, or whether they're going to lock arms and say, we're not going to inherit the hatreds of our parents and move forward. And it turns out that these same tools of dialogue that have been so finely honed for geopolitical purposes are really valuable to all of us in different ways of building bridges with people who we wouldn't automatically connect with or agree with.
Yeah. So in your post-service life, you've not only worked with these communities, but now here we are on this stage. You've written a book, which, you know, we both come from a place where publicly talking about what we used to do is anathema to some members of the community. Why did you choose media? Why did you choose this medium?
I think there is this moment to your earlier question about what's the vampire bat. I really do feel urgently that our ability to listen to one another and connect with one another as Americans and move this country forward toward a more perfect union is in places evaporating. And it's not too late, we can get it back, but it really should be the urgent mission of each of us as Americans to say, this is one threat that we can't delegate to our military, can't delegate to the IC. This is on each and every one of us to try and do the work of creating that pyramid model in our mind and integrating our worldview with those of our fellow citizens in order to be able to find some path that we can agree on together. Even if that's setting these issues aside for a minute and just connecting on something more substantive or different from politics. I think also it was important to me that young women in particular consider service in general, but this particular form of service. One of the challenges with the pop culture depictions of this kind of work is that women are either excluded or they're painted as these kind of like femme fatale characters that have no actual substantive capabilities beyond like kicking doors down with like thigh-high boots. And this kind of window dressing that's in some way empowering is actually so diminishing to the incredibly difficult substantive work that young women do every day in the intelligence and military worlds. And I think that it has become apparent in a lot of national security circles over the last 10 to 20 years that women are particularly well suited to this kind of work. I mean, it's not an accident that we now not only have a director of CIA, but director of each of the directorates beneath her, all of those senior positions being held by women, which makes me so hopeful for the role of the agency in peacemaking going forward. But the traits that we traditionally identify with more feminine approach to problem solving, which is emotional intelligence, intuition, the ability to read people, the ability to multitask, these are all crucial to human intelligence work, which is crucial to national security. And so when young women of skill and intellect and substance discount this because they're not the brash door kickers that they see in the movies, I think it's a great loss to us as a country. And I'm a deep believer in the fact that each of us has a unique call to service to our community, to our country, and that if you get really still for a minute, you'll hear what it is. And may not be the intelligence community, it may not be the military, maybe it's volunteering at your Y or going and helping after a natural disaster, being a crossing guard, whatever it is, that call to service is really present in each of us. And the one thing that I guarantee you is if you get really quiet, The one thing you will hear that your call to service is not is yelling at people on the other side of the aisle about why they're wrong, because that really, really doesn't do a service to our country. So I think that it felt like a time where empowering people here at home to do some small act of dialogue building, community building, or service would help to make the threats that the media makes loom large in our life every day feel more manageable.
Yeah. I think it's also just another poignant example of how the stuff from your book is applicable and relevant to some of our domestic issues. If you integrate women successfully into law enforcement communities, there's 3x less officer-involved shootings, right? Like, these are like bringing those skill sets to bear. It's kind of a perfect example. I guess, I want to make sure we have plenty of time or enough time for audience questions, but I guess I'd like to know what's next. Like, you're a firm believer in service. How are you going to continue your service? How are you #still serving beyond the book?
Well, I think that sharing human experiences has been the through line for me, right? As an aspiring baby journalist, as that teenager back in Burma, interviewing Suu Kyi and bringing her words out, through to telling the stories of the threats and groups and adversaries that needed to be on the radar screen of our policymakers to our policymakers, which is, as you point out, its own form of journalism with just a several hundred strong audience rather than the broader global audience that journalists have. Through to the work that I'm doing now and plan to do, the through line is really in every sense saying none of us is here very long. Human life is very short, and we only get the experiences that we get in a lifetime. The only way to broaden your understanding of the world is to read or watch or hear the stories and perspectives of others. And so I think in this moment, storytelling is actually more critical than ever to expanding our understanding of the world and contributing to our security. So in general, I think my calling is around using these tools to create dialogue and taking those stories and sharing them more broadly. You and I are working on one really powerful example of that.
Shameless plug for our Netflix series. Right? I'm immensely proud of this, so I'm glad you're bringing it up.
Yeah, so Kaj has produced, and I present a Netflix series that is coming up here end of this year, beginning of next, that looks at the business interests and business considerations that drive warfare. The first season is about the war on drugs. And what is very useful, I think, about this series is that we go all over the world. I filmed the whole thing in the third trimester of my pregnancy, of my second pregnancy. So
you're a good
thank you
friend,
to my husband.
right? And you're a good friend when you send your third trimester pregnant friend to Myanmar to shoot a TV series, right?
And Colombia to embed with the military for the FARC-held territory that has held out against the
I thought it would be
deal,
nostalgic for Bobcat.
Kenya. But what was worth all of that travel at that time was really being able to tell the human stories on the ground of the growers, the mules, the traders, people who we tend to cast as pure villains, and understanding and unpacking the economic and security elements and incentives that drive their behavior. And time and again, there's the same realization that, these aren't, in many cases, purely moral choices. These are human responses that are very predictable to economic incentives that are available to anyone at a given time. And they're not only predictable, but they're rational. And that's a hugely reassuring thing, because if it's just, some people are good and some people are bad and that's how it is, then there's nothing we can do about it, right? But if we understand that these are predictable responses to admittedly complex economic incentive maps, then we can begin to understand how to move levers and change those incentives. And so that story is, I mean, that series is really a mosaic of human stories that demonstrates across the board why the current tack that we're taking in the war on drugs in particular is just not working. I mean, we start out with the cocaine episode, and you look at Colombia, and we've put, since the early 2000s, $10.5 billion of US taxpayer money, and almost 500,000 Colombians have died. And last year, more cocaine shipped out of Colombia than any year on record. This is just a tremendous, tremendous waste of resources, both lives and treasure. And yet we continue to do it, year in, year out. We think that the war on terror is the longest war, and we forget that the war on drugs has been going on decades, even longer. And so those stories, being able to tell the everyday human stories in people's homes with their children, looking at the reality of the decisions that are being made so that we can understand what might move the needle and bring an end to the violence and the combat that we're seeing, in that case, around the drug trade, is emblematic of the kind of projects that I'm doing going forward. I mean, these are bringing a human face to systems level problems that can sometimes feel overwhelming or unsolvable if you don't understand the people on the ground that are driving them.
Yeah, and I would simply add to ask provocative questions about the framing of all of these policies, right? You could make the argument that using war as a metaphor for tackling social problems has been a tremendous part of the issue, and I think the body of your work really probes that thesis, right? Does it work to have a war on poverty? Does it work to have a war on drugs? Does it work to have a war on terror?
I mean, in general, right, we've seen that wars on nouns create more of the noun that they're fighting. Right. I think there is a lot of recognition of that, broadly speaking, in government now. This idea that even the war on terror, that these approaches have to be more nuanced. And I think we are moving into an era where are we running out of time?
Yeah, but I want to hear this.
Well,
and,
I was going to say, I think we're moving into an era where not only is almost every conflict asymmetrical, right? I mean, we really don't have state versus state conflicts in the same way that they used to be prevalent. Almost everything is against one party as a non-state actor or a resistance movement.
Even if they are great powers,
yeah,
they're often done with proxy elements, right?
Right, and so as that evolution has taken place, we've also had the immense evolution of technology in warfighting, so that in almost every instance now, the appropriate boots on the ground footprint is far less than what it would have been several decades ago. And then you still have 1 million plus men and women who are in our armed forces. And I think that this is a really interesting moment to think about what the best use is of some of these now underused elements of the military. I think that we face, in the vampire bat threat category, I think one of the other great and under-described threats that we face is the soft power initiative of China right now. They are investing $1 trillion in 2/3 of the world's countries on infrastructure projects, and they have 1 million Chinese people on the ground implementing them. When you're in Kenya and you ride the train from Nairobi to Mombasa, it's a brand new gleaming Chinese train, and the people that take your tickets and check your luggage are all Chinese. They're all smiling. It's an amazingly powerful initiative, and it's not charity. This is a shrewd geopolitical move. And the amount of money that they are investing is almost matched, if you look year for year, in the amount of money that we're spending combating, the war on terror and others in a much more kinetic and often destructive capacity. And I think we do need to be cognizant of the fact that an American flag on a brand new train would have a very different impact from an American flag on shrapnel and rubble, even if it was a legitimate target. And I think that the deployment of our resources in terms of both people and treasure to build infrastructure in that way would not only counteract the threat from China, where it is, if we don't do something soon, the potential for many allies to end up in the Chinese friendship zone, as they call it, over the next few decades is pretty severe. But on top of that, I think our young men and women, 18, 19 years old, that we send overseas to get some discipline, to support the interests of the United States, to get access to the GI Bill, to get out of their hometown, to be able to have all of those benefits while building and learning marketable job skills for when they come back with less trauma, less PTSD, I think could be a very positive deployment of some of those underused resources.
Totally. I like to say in 1962, with one stroke of the pen, President Kennedy created both the SEAL teams and the Peace Corps, right?
Yeah, and the Peace Corps
look
is a
at the budget
great model for
proportionality
this, right?
Of those, yeah.
But
Amaryllis, I'm going to stop you in the interest of all these wonderful people here, and I'll even plug for you. You can. There's more of that coming out. You'll have to trust me on that. Amaryllis has been doing some extraordinary writing on this topic, and just so it's not all highfalutin when you get like the Harvardian and the Oxfordian up here, there's also some big scripted stuff coming down the pipe. Can you talk about that for 15 seconds?
Bree,
Yeah.
So this book, I'm very grateful and happy to say that the TV adaptation of it is in the hands of Brie Larson and an extraordinary team around her.
Yeah.
And she
No relation. She spells her name the wrong way.
The
right,
wrong
right,
way. Yeah, Larson, Owen. But Brie's a force of nature. Her brain is electric. Whenever we have what's intended to be a 5-minute conversation, we fall into one another for 3 hours and kind of come up saying like, oh, well, we just tackled all the world's problems. She is a person of great conscience, and she is very curious about what conflict waging and conflict resolution looks like as women begin to take on more of these roles and participate in both the war fighting and the negotiation and peace table. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, along with some very, very good entertainment in the adaptation. I'm really excited to kind of show a more authentic and yet still very exhilarating story of the female intelligence collector.
Amazing, amazing. I am excited alongside you. We violated every rule of the intelligence community in our meeting here. We didn't, we didn't determine the time.
We didn't determine the time.
We didn't
That's
determine
true.
the safe routes out,
Yeah. That one looks pretty good.
Yep, infill, exfil. So with that, I'd like to open it up for a few questions. There's microphones over at the side here. Yep, sprinting to the front is definitely the way to ask the first question.
I'm close.
Yeah. Oh, and before I start, sorry to interrupt you, sir. Just a few ground rules. We're not going to be talking about tradecraft or anything that happens in the monitor. There's still plenty of like classified and operational stuff that is out of bounds. It's not a big deal because in the book, most of the stuff from when we were operational is now so outdated because the velocity of change is so quick. I think there's a lot of
White
anecdotes
hairs up
about
here.
the email draft box. I think a former director of the CIA ruined that one.
Oh, I
for
mean,
us.
all of the stuff that is in this book, I don't envy the people who do this work today. There's biometrics, there's facial recognition, there's, we were high tech by leaving drafts in the email inbox. But I think, in many ways, I was like the last of the kind of Cold War generation, or like taught at least by the Cold War generation, where we got docked points in training if we even engaged with cell phones or the internet at all. So it was the tradecraft has necessarily evolved immensely since this book and since my work. So we don't have much insight into the.
We have a conundrum here because
Uh-oh.
the question, Mike, but you took over the podium.
Oh, that was a power move, sir.
That is. Look, you're.
I'm sorry.
You're here.
Who's got the camera on? Might as well just take it.
That is a power move.
My name's Leonard,
Hi,
and
Leonard.
you mentioned early on the truth, something relating to the truth. And as a spy, when you go and fight folks, and I don't want to say terror or whatever, or when you go and try to gather intelligence on other folks, do you ever find that what their belief in is also a truth? And have you ever come across pure evil versus, they're just bad people and what they believe in is different from our belief and their truth is different from our truth?
That is a great question. It is really the fundamental question at the core of this book. So great job.
It's also a great question, Leonard, because it ends in a question, which is not
Yeah.
always the case here.
Yeah.
So thank you very
Thank
much.
That goes back to the triangle and the square and the pyramid, right? And I think any good human intelligence officer, diplomat, business person, friend, has this challenge when overseas and even here at home, when faced with something that can seem on the face of it to be inexplicable, abhorrent, to really say, everybody believes that they're the good guy. So how, given what this person is doing, how, when they wake up on a given Tuesday morning and they're about to drive a Franken truck into a civilian neighborhood and blow it up, how do they think that they're the good guy? Right? And if we don't have the courage to ask that question, which can put you in some pretty scary territory, then we don't stand a hope of understanding how to stop it. And one of the things that happens when you ask that question is some of the contributing factors are things that are incredibly difficult to grapple with and that could create violence in anybody. And if one has enough courage, they can even venture that had they had the same set of experiences, they might have responded the same way. And that can be a very scary thought process to go through. It takes a lot of reflection and a lot of maturity in the end to be able to understand that. But until we understand it, I don't think we stand a hope of preventing it. So, one of the things that still bugs me and that I find to be not very helpful to our security conversations going forward is, when I hear people still say, we were attacked on 9/11, we were attacked on these other times, and when people say, why did this horrendous thing happen? They hate us because we're free. That phrase to me has some truth in it, as any overgeneralization does, but it to me doesn't feel very helpful because it ignores the fact that there were very specific lists of grievances that were expressed before and after each of these major last attacks over the last 30 years. And there's no moral person in this room, probably in this country, that would say that because of these grievances, any of these acts were even remotely close to justified or legal or understandable. But when you look at them, you can have a rational and helpful conversation about whether all of these policies should continue to be our policies, given that they are having the impact of driving violence from the adversary, or whether there are certain policies in there that could be adapted or updated. In the case of the Al-Qaeda attacks in the 90s and leading into 9/11, that list never changed, and it was shared over and over again, written in letters to the New York Times from the Al-Qaeda leadership and others. And some of those were non-negotiables, right? I mean, they had support for the State of Israel, which has been American policy from the outset and continues to be, and I think most Americans would consider to be part of our national security posture. But then you have, monetary support for over 50 or 60% of the Egyptian security budget, which was being used to conduct pretty extreme enhanced interrogation torture at the time. That many of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad fighters that became the number 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s in Al-Qaeda had come from that background of undergoing horrendous torture at the hands of the Egyptians. And they had been fighting Egypt, specifically, not the authoritarian government in Egypt, for years. And it was bin Laden who said to them, that's the near enemy, but you're never going to defeat the near enemy until you defeat the far enemy, because all of their budget comes from America. As a country, did we in the 90s think that supporting the Egyptian security services in the way that they were debriefing detainees was important enough to our national security have it be one of 10 reasons why we were getting attacked, and our diplomats, our military officers on the USS Cole, our diplomatic staff in the Africa bombings were losing their lives. I don't know. But we never had that conversation as a country because sometimes it's easier to talk in kind of these euphemisms or overgeneralizations. And so, yes, I think whether or not you find any validity in them, it's incredibly important to actually enumerate and name and explore what the grievances are so that you can begin to talk about which of those there might be a way to find common ground on, and which of them are non-negotiable, steadfast, pillars of our national security policy. And on the question of evil, my sister studies childhood psychopathy, and it's a very fascinating area of medical study where, you can see on a brain scan these deadened areas where you would normally be able to put yourself in another person's shoes, and you really are not able in your brain as an actual disability to have that natural, empathetic, compassionate response that humans are born with. And it can be seen as early as 2, 3, 4 years old. The incidence of that is worldwide the same. What is interesting is that in the intelligence, the military world, and also in the terror group world, we actually see less incidents of psychopathy because all of those are places where trust and brother and sisterhood are so important that if you're not able to build those relationships and something about your ability to communicate seems off, you often don't do very well in those environments. And so for the most part, I think the people fighting these wars are actually less likely to be psychopaths than your average person on the street. I think generally they're people of principle. You may think that their principles are abhorrent, but for the most part, the fighting on both sides is driven by a sense that what they are doing, what we are doing, what they are doing is a sacrifice on behalf of their community, their children, their values, rather than being, an expression of pure evil.
Wonderful. Sir?
Amaryllis, you've been giving us an hour of beautiful policy overviews, but I think some of us, maybe many of us, would love to hear about your life undercover. And so could you please
That's the
give us-
book you have in your hand.
Oh, what is it? Yeah.
We're trying not to do a spoiler
Yeah.
alert.
Well, is it possible you could share with us at least one personal story of when you were undercover out in the field and you were risking your life and you were playing a deceitful role and maybe you got away just by the skin of your teeth?
So what I would say is that, because one of the sort of peculiar things about having worked in government is that when we tell those stories, they go through a review process. That review process ensures that everything that needs to be omitted and changed is. And therefore, the document, the writing, has to stand for itself. And that's not just a cheeky way to get you all to actually read the book. But what I can say is that this work is all-encompassing and involved, family choices, personal choices at great risk and with great loneliness. And I think that that's something that we often forget of our young people who serve today. And one thing that you will find when you read the book is just a sort of constant reminder of how incredibly young I was and how incredibly young many of the warfighters and intelligence officers who are making these critical decisions are. And that's, for the same reason it was with me, which is that the most pristine cover belongs to people who come straight out of training, who haven't been out there operating, and so their cover hasn't been eroded. And therefore, by a kind of strange twist, the most experienced officers can't actually do work in a lot of the environments where there are the highest stakes because their cover has begun to be eroded. So we often see the youngest officers doing this work because nobody suspects yet that they have this affiliation. And it's something that we've seen through history. You go back and look at World War I and the degree to which, 3 or 4 20-somethings at the negotiating table carved up the entire Middle East. That's one of the reasons I called it coming of age in the CIA, is this idea that while taking on these incredibly challenging operations and moral complexity, all we intelligence officers and warfighters were also just figuring out who we were, just doing the things that normal 20-somethings do. And that is maybe an unusual way to spend your 20s, but it makes for some pretty good stories. So I'm sorry not to spoil the book, but hopefully you'll have a cup of tea when you get home and break it open.
There is an awesome moment where Amaryllis is living in China, and which I'm amazed you had told me this story before. I was so happy to see that it cleared the PRB review process so that you could share it with everybody. But imagine being pregnant under non-official cover, and your house being both surveilled by the Chinese government for espionage and then counter-surveilled by the CIA to make sure that no information was escaping. And this is how you go through your first trimester of your first pregnancy. It's pretty extraordinary. I think you'll enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, so actually that was my question, because I have the New York Times review here, and basically that's what they say. But they also say that you pretended to be, you and your ex-husband, to be art entrepreneurs in Shanghai. Now, I know a little bit about, art collection, a little bit. I know people in that field have to be very knowledgeable, going back hundreds of years, about artists and evaluating collections. And how did you play that role? It must have been really challenging.
Well, I'm not going to get into the operational side of it, except to say that just independently of that, my family are great lovers of art, and we have, I think, like 6 art history degrees amongst us. And I grew up with all of my family travel sort of being integrated into that love of art and collection personally. One of the things that is really important in trying to figure out how to put people who don't look like they belong in environments where they can do this work is to really lean into who they are. Like you it's like when you're stuck on ice, right? Steer into the skid. Mm-hmm. So if you're a young white girl, you take on a job that is genuinely something that you know a great deal about and that makes sense for, a young white girl to do. And being a kind of gallerina that works in the art world is certainly in keeping with that persona. And I think it's one of the great challenges, right, is to be in a place and be able to move and operate freely enough that you can do the important work that you're there to do. My hands are a little bit tied up about going beyond that, but again, I really hope you enjoy the book. And it's all there's a lot in there that tackles that very question.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Despite our poor mission planning, no battle plan survives the first shot, but this seemed to do pretty well. It's 8:01, so we're going to wrap here and give Amaryllis a chance to sign some books and talk to you all individually. And I just want to thank you 100% for coming out and engaging with this discussion. Let's give Amaryllis a hand.
Thank you, Bev.